Hello, everyone. Have you also been looking for tried and tested applications of AI at each step in the design process? Our guest today may have been secretly building it. Hello, everyone. Warm welcome to SDN Community Voices, our weekly live touchpoint. This is our 56th fireside chat, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Sakshi Kumari. I'm a designer, an anthropologist, and a workshop facilitator based in Bangalore, and your SDN Community Voices host for today. Before we begin, here is a question for you all. Tell us in the comments where you are joining from and one AI tool you use the most in your design process. Over the last couple of years, every week there seems to be a new claim about how AI has completely transformed the way designers work. However, the information is scattered, the tools keep changing. What worked 6 months ago may not even work today. And while there are countless examples of using AI for individual tasks, there are very few conversations about how AI actually fits into the real design process where we make sense of complex situations, understand people, balance constraints, and carry context forward from one stage of the project to another. And that is why I wanted to have this conversation with Siddharth today. Let us welcome him on stage. Hi,
Hey,
Siddharth. Welcome.
hey, Sakshi. Thanks for inviting me.
I'll give a quick round of introduction to the audience about you, and then we'll get on to the questions. So, Siddharth has spent almost a decade working across service design, research, and systems thinking. Over the last few years, he as well his team, they have been extensively experimenting with AI within the real world service design and research projects. They are not just using it to summarize interviews or generate only reports, but understanding where it genuinely adds value, where it does not, and how teams can maintain quality while working with AI. However, so that before we get into any of the AI talk, let us step back and let's talk about your journey into service design first of all. How did you end up in service design at the first place?
Well, for me, my initial training and work has been in architecture. So, when I got introduced to the world of business, when I joined a small early stage startup in New Delhi, it was a robotics startup, and they had hired me as an in house designer. It was then that I got a chance to work with the founders on certain investor pitches. So, identifying what could be a typical ROI for design in their use case. We were having a robotics production line for furniture
Okay.
and allied products. And while making those pitches and presentation decks is when I began to understand that I really don't know a lot about the world of business or even about services and how they play out into the world, right? And it took me a time of a year of talking and to different practitioners to find out what they have learned, which of course I was not privy to previously. And that led me to trying my hand at a course in service design. So it was a completely new world for me.
Got it.
And yeah,
So that we actually had a long chat about how much you have been investing your time experimenting with AI. So if you compare your thinking today with where you were 18 months back, almost 1.5 years back, what do you think is the biggest shift?
I think one of the biggest shift for me as a practitioner in this space with respect to AI is about identifying what it is really useful for. And we had so many assumptions starting out when I remember way back in 2022 when we got our hands on some of the first models to work on, and we tried to make use of it almost everywhere in the design process, only to come to understand that it is good at certain things, it may not give reliable results at certain other things. For example, of course, one of the most cumbersome areas to make use of it was user research, or essentially extracting insights and analysis of user research, right? Uh, and there we quickly began to find that it gives some very reliable results in certain cases. For example, when you are collecting key pieces of evidence from large data sets, as long as they are organized.
Mhm.
But in certain other cases, things began to change in terms of what these models could do versus what they were advertised for, and slowly, even our mindset around various design processes began to change. Especially if I'm talking from the perspective of service design,
Got it.
not only in within the organization but also expectations to what service design is supposed to do with AI based model and similars. So
Understand. And as designers, our process starts with researching, empathizing with users. So that is the stage that generates most amount of data, I would say. And this happens in form of interviews, trend research, surveys, many other things. At what stage do you introduce AI into your workflow?
well, uh, there has been constant improvisation from our side. We have been experimenting a lot, talking to many other experts who have been at it for a much higher intensity, so to say. But for us, it has been quite successful as a tool to be introduced in any kind of divergent thinking formats. So, for example, when you're developing concepts, when you are making people or participants in a workshop, be they be designers or non-designers, to think in ways where, let's say, it takes a lot of time for humans to transcend the logic that they are being exposed to. AI
Right.
has been very good at, or at least like most chatbots, the most modern models have been very good at summarizing information and
Yeah.
even the most unlikely information. So, one thing we had been experimenting with is how to use AI based outputs in future research or future studies, essentially in transition design. So, looking at speculative storylines, looking at situations where you have a lot of context data,
Mhm.
which, if shelled together or put together, gives AI a rich database to work with, and then generates an output which helps humans to then use as food for thought rather than the final answer.
Hmm. Got it. When you started using AI, you would have had some assumptions initially, when especially I think you started using it at the very initial stage, like almost 2022, even before that, maybe. So
No,
what?
mostly it was 2022, late
22?
2022, early 23
Got it.
is when
Got
we
it.
were.
So what were the assumptions that turned out to be completely wrong?
I think one of the biggest assumptions was that, which we all had in the beginning days, was that if you pile up all the data onto a chatbot, or probably into a storage database, which could be then accessed by an agent, it would somehow come up with an answer, or
Yeah.
it would somehow give you crystal clear insights, which actually never happens, not even in the modern models.
Right.
Uh, but there it was also one thing that we also began to understand, that if we as humans can't essentially do such a thing, which is basically make sense of large data and then create summarized outputs, then how do we expect a machine to do the same when the required constraints are not set?
Got it. Got it.
So of course that was a big learning, and we've been all through different teams that I've worked with, I've come across so many people who have been trying to grapple with the same problem and
Absolutely.
trying to find their own solutions, some very good ones actually.
Got it. So you mentioned about constraints. So you mentioned about the limitations when you started working and assumptions people had, right? So one thing that you did is to add constraints to make AI useful, right? Can you elaborate a little bit more on that? And if there are any other things, any other steps that you added in your process to make AI more helpful, if you can elaborate on that a little bit.
Sure. Uh, so one important learning, as I said, was that how to set constraints in the data that you're inputting into the system.
Yeah.
From a designer's perspective, or at least from my limited understanding into the topic of contextualization, a
Hmm.
constraint is essentially something which tells or defines for a processor or a machine what to look at and in what sense. Like, because the big assumption that we all tend to make with artificial intelligence, especially the generative artificial intelligence models or LLMs that we have right now, is that they would be able to make sense of the data we are
Hmm.
inputting,
Yes.
which they essentially cannot. Sense making is something that has to be provided to them as a pattern, right?
Yeah.
So, for a problem statement, just as constraints help designers understand the limits within which they are working,
Hmm.
even from the perspective of developing their own process or the resource at hand, it's similar for an AI model, right? So defining, for example, if you're looking into users, then the user as an individual, what constraints does the individual exist in, or the reasoning behind why an individual thinks what they think, or what are their belief patterns, how they are placed within a community or within an organized context, and what constraints are defined because of that context happening, and then how that entire grouping is then placed inside of a system, right?
Yeah.
These definitions have to be clearly defined, and they begin to act as guardrails for a large language model to effectively work within, right? I'll give you a very simple example, probably because like this, the latter was mostly kind of a geeky talk. But if you think about it, let's say if you're handling something as basic as a patient wanting to change the timings of their medicine, or a schedule
Hmm.
which they are put into. For example, let's say you're on a diet, or you're on um, a program, right? So, and you demand a change of pace. For example, you don't want to have the next set of exercise or the next set of inputs to be provided to you from your healthcare provider,
Yeah.
right? Now, if the healthcare provider or the AI chatbot that it is discussing the same thing with is not aware of what are the situations in which this patient exists. For example, this patient could be uh, a homemaker. They could be a person who has to go to work at a certain period of time, or they could be somebody who might have, let's say, certain other accessibility requirements,
Hmm.
right? For example, people often, in late stages of different chronic conditions, people often have a very high cortisol level. So it happens so that they tend to grow impatient, right? And in that scenario, if this information is not inputted as a pattern into the system,
Hmm.
of course the pattern, of course the chatbot would be oblivious to it and would not be able to generate enough empathy towards uh, a patient of this sort, right?
Yeah.
Again, it's a unique case. Similarly, on the process side, if the model does not understand the caseload or the complexity of information which is being handled by the humans, which are inputting or outputting data, then again, as you've seen in most of our work as well, that these chatbots generate a huge amount of data, which then becomes even cumbersome to read. Like we have all heard about situations where somebody asks their platform to or their chatbot to make a detailed report, and then that detailed report is then fed into another chatbot by the reader to generate 10 basic points.
Yeah,
Nobody actually goes to the through the nuances of that report or the content behind it,
yeah,
right? So we are all working under our constraints or under our contextual uh, boxes, right? And so the platforms that we are using, for that matter, in this case, a large language model processor also has to be aware of those constraints,
right.
and it is the job of the person inputting the data into the system who has to take care of it.
Right, right. I actually have a follow up here. Uh, have in your design process, have you ever added a constraint too early that probably ended up choking the process instead of helping with it? Has there been such an instance ever?
Yeah, that's a good question. So there was a situation in the early days when we were experimenting with using this in analyzing interview transcripts and also workshop transcripts, where we would try to ask it to generate as many outcomes as or as many insights as possible,
Yeah.
uh, which would, in the real world, now we know that it would require certain classification to be inputted into the system, under which it should extract something,
Okay.
right?
Yeah.
So for example, if I give an entire chat summary of two people conversation to a chatbot, it would, in the name of insights, generate everything from the actual the topic which the two people are talking about, to
Yeah.
even things like this person is sitting this close to the mic and this person is looking this way or that way, or so many times goodbye or hi, or hello was said, right?
Yeah.
These models work on predictive text analysis, right? So what it does is that every time it sees an important verb in a sentence, it looks for likely adjectives with which it has been used, and then generates an output out of that.
Hmm.
Now, in natural conversations, that happens n number of times, which
Yeah.
means the output generates a huge amount of data through which somebody has to manually go through to see which ones are the useful components.
Right.
And in those early days, it was generating so much of this data that it was we ended up concluding that probably it's better to have one person to actually sit through and do this thing manually, rather than going through this huge amount of, let's say, slop which has been produced, right?
Yeah. Yes.
The problem of production of slop is not that of what the model is capable of producing. It's about how clearly we have inputted the commands,
Hmm. Hmm.
right? So the moment you give very specific constraints,
Yeah.
then it has something to rely on, or use them as base definitions to only extract things which are relevant,
Yeah.
right? But what is relevant has to be defined by us.
Hmm.
So yeah, I mean, of course, that was creating a big bottleneck, and
Right.
roughly it took us 1.5 months of trial and error and using different models. And there were so many AI products in the user research space that had sprung up at that time, and we were first thinking that these different products would actually help with that. But again, the problem was on our side, in what we were inputting and the
Un-
expectation we were having from these models.
Understood. So there, so the point that we discussed about right now about designing constraints rather, I would say, and deciding on what you want AI to do and what not. So there seems to be a clear line between where you decide what you want to let AI do versus what you don't want AI to do and want to keep it to yourself. Where is that line today, and how has it moved in last few years for you, especially?
Well, honestly, it has moved a lot.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, as I said, every time a new capability comes with these models. For example, when Claude introduced in the early days, it from being a chatbot, it then had a workbench space, followed by it introducing Claude Code, then inbuilt skills, then incorporated agents. And similarly, many other platforms, for example, ChatGPT, also then began to catch up, and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
Many different things gave rise to new expectations, and I think the way where we tried to initially use it was to, in a way, lessen our work, which was essentially in the boring arena. For example, like going through long transcripts, huge amounts of quantitative data, huge Excel sheets, and etc. We were trying to see if these models could do it for ourselves, and we could do or spend time more on conceptualizing.
Mm.
While now we understand that, or at least like that has been my derivation, that the best use of these models is to make them think beside you, right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so you think with them, right? You use them as a sounding board, and that too with a grain of salt, because again, unless you have provided them with the right quality of segregated data,
Mm.
uh, it will give you generic answers, right? And so moving it from qualitative and quantitative analysis to something very specific as evidence finding, right?
Right.
Or using it for speculative thinking, or disruptive thinking. uh, just as how we as human designers, we were taught how to do abductive reasoning in case of concept development, or even looking at what it generates as an initial food for thought. Has been a few big shifts for me personally,
Yeah.
and the design teams that I've worked with. And of course, as we have all seen, it is able to generate certain useful prototypes, which I would say that these prototypes are not immediately deployable for testing. Rather, they give you a template on which a testable prototype can be built upon, right? So it
Could you
again
elaborate
is
a little bit more on this part?
right. So, like ever since the whole vibe coding, kind of gained traction,
Yeah.
and, platforms like Lovable and many others had come into play, and, Emergent, Codex, etc., Cloud Code, we were, trying to see which one could produce a prototype which could immediately go for testing,
Yeah.
right? Because the company, like, I mean, the organizations that we tend to work with, they want speed. They want that, okay, first of all, we have already taken so much time to convince them that testing is necessary. Now that they have agreed to testing, they
Yeah.
want to get it done fast, right? So that things could go to production, right? And so that had led us to immediately start using vibe coded prototypes for testing, the way we used to use Figma prototypes,
Yes.
right? Or clickable walkthroughs, only to find that if the generated UI is not well thought or well structured, it won't function. It would rather create its own nuances in the people who are using it, and that would probably generate new information which may or may not be useful for us,
True.
depending on how or where we are in the design process, right?
Yeah. Right.
Now that essentially means that if it is generating these new nuances, why not test it within the design team first, or your devs, or within the product design department itself
Right.
within the company, to see that, okay, this could also be a likely output of what we are demanding,
Yes.
and
Yes.
then trying to assess it for its own experience. because ultimately, since you can't replicate an output in these models, why not make them useful for what they are, which is generating completely new scenarios,
Mm.
uh, which then can be learned from. So you can take the code elements from those and
Yeah.
combine them, and probably it gives you those kit of parts to reassemble and put it out
Yeah.
as a workable prototype.
Yes.
So
I actually have a recent instance that I would like to mention over here. You mentioned about everybody now vibe coding and creating a product trying to use for themselves or even trying to put to market, right? So last week I was in Surat. I'm currently working on a software for chartered accountant firms in India. And I interviewed five different firms there. What we realized was each, almost all of them have been trying to vibe code a solution for themselves just for their own firm. They created something, none of them were really useful long term for them. Like they gave it a try, they found like it would work the way they wanted to track things for themselves, but it did not really stay with them.
So, I mean, to me, this says a lot. Uh, since everybody can now produce something, doesn't mean that every produced element could be useful, or every produced element can be judged by everybody. Because as designers, our biggest job is to have the right judgment, to
True.
make the right decisions, right? So design ultimately, like one of my professors used to describe design process as the as sequential decision making, just like any expert does in their own domain, right?
That's a very nice way to put it.
Yeah, and now when you think about it, like for example, if you as a designer get to decide on, let's say, a medical report,
Hmm.
right? How would you even do that? Because
Yeah.
you do not have domain expertise. And you might be able to generate a report similar to that,
Yeah.
just because it's like the way you generate another clickable prototype.
Yeah.
But do we have the capability of assessing whether the generated output is useful or not, right?
Yeah.
That's the biggest if in this.
Yes. Yes. Let us move to the next question. One challenge with AI is that context often gets fragmented as project moves from research to insight generation phase to creating concepts and then finally towards implementation, right? How do you make sure important context is not getting lost along the way?
That's a very important area of study, and I think I mean that is something which we have to continuously look at, because this aspect of maintaining the context definitions correctly is not only something that our AI models grapple with, it's also something that we as humans grapple with. uh, and for that it is very important that are like we have utmost clarity on how the different elements of context are defined, right? So like way back when I was working in Iconstorm in Frankfurt, we used to work on elements like what is individual or user data, which you directly acquire from a user group, which is under study. Then what is the organizational data? For example, uh, commonly in a company, this is what is contained in the company's inherent data lake, right? So the types of resources, past projects, trend reports, and many other such things, right? And then there was systemic data, as I had mentioned to you earlier, that it's all about the different rules, regulations, laws, or even in service design we have a term called institutional logics, or institutional pressures under which this organization exists
Yeah.
in a market system,
Yeah.
right? Or in a supply chain, or in a stakeholder ecosystem, if you can simply put that,
Yeah.
right? All that information has to be well structured, well defined, and inputted into the model in a way that the the model has to be then enabled using, like, let's say if you're using a skill board, or if you're using a folder system as of today, because development of skills or loops is all the new talk around AI models.
Yeah.
So if in those loop uh, if in those loop based prompts, you have to specifically mention what data to access for what and when.
Yeah.
uh, that way, at least for now, some of the best results in maintaining context
Yeah.
are being achieved. um, it's of course, again, there are chances where model collapse happens with too much data being inputted into a model,
Yeah.
which is basically that, post a certain extent of data, it starts to hallucinate, and then continuous hallucination then leads to a completely different reality
Yeah.
which the model is presenting to you. And if you are humanly not aware of how much this deviation is, you
Hmm.
won't be able to pull it back, right? So again, there are certain limitations to it which still exist, as they had existed all the way back since 2022 and 23. But even then, a certain amount of reliability has begun to appear when you put or define the contextual backdrop quite specifically.
Yeah. 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 For lack of time, Siddharth, I have one last question, and then we'll move to audience Q&A.
Sure.
If someone is starting today, he or she may not ever get a chance to do it slow, the manual way, like how we started, right, a few years back, without AI. What do you think they might miss out on that you learned by doing it the hard way first?
I think uh, what they might miss out on, there's a very big chance, is doing it the manual way itself and learning from the nuances of doing it this way.
Mm-hmm.
Where, I'll give you a very simple example. There's a big change which has happened in how we take interviews over the period of time, right? When we were responsible for analyzing interviews on our own, or when I was at least taught how to do it,
Mm-hmm.
there was a lot of nuance in reading body language of the person sitting in front of you, in also trying to see what they have spoken, where and with what tonality. Also, very specific things like, if this person is, let's say we are conversing in English, and let's say in both our cases English is not our native language. We come from very different contexts, we understand this language also in a very different way,
Hmm.
right? So analyzing that at a human level used to be one of the key skills of, let's say, an interviewer, who would then derive useful insights from it. When you simply feed it into a model that doesn't fully understand the surrounding context of your language, it becomes, the outputs become very generic,
Hmm.
and a person solely relying on that would be far away from these nuances. It's just like now hardly anybody knows how to read physical maps, while we are heavily dependent on Google Map navigation,
Yes.
or Apple
Yes.
map.
I can't imagine moving around the town without Google Maps. Even my own hometown now, I feel.
Yeah, so I mean, this is a skill loss at the end of the day, which we all suffer from. And again, similarly, reading long text is a skill loss that we have
Yeah.
all
Yeah.
been exposed to. So yeah, I mean, I would definitely advise that people should carry out some parts of user research on their own.
Yeah. Yeah. Definitely. All right. This brings us to the Q&A part of our session. If you have any questions for Siddharth, please drop them in the comments. All right. One question. What is one thing about your work today that you think might look wrong or outdated in next 5 years?
Okay, that's That's a difficult question because, like, I mean, honestly, things have changed so fast. I mean, 5 years means like five different trends
Yeah.
altogether, or even more.
Yeah.
Uh, I think what would change is how we look at prototypes themselves,
Mm-hmm.
because at least like from the age of the internet, one big pattern in digital products has been all about receiving packeted information upfront, right? So when you open a website, you go through a whole choreography or sequence of information through different pages, right? Through clickables. While what has changed with the advent of different chatbots is now you are asking rather than getting that information right there, right? And the way in which you ask creates a difference in what you receive. It has come very near to natural language processing, uh, and so the way we look at these prototypes in terms of web pages, in terms of clickable systems, is going to drastically change very soon. People are talking about generative UI, where uh, it would change, like the interface would change as per your requirements, as per your long term patterns, which the AI would have picked up. So experience would be drastically different for everyone, and probably like it's only a matter of time to see how much that would be positive in nature.
Mm-hmm.
um, it could also be kind of scary for different situations. For example, but it's like you're going to the airport, and now the layout of the airport itself has changed
Yes.
based based on what you expressed last time when you went there.
Yes.
Uh, but who knows? I mean, like this is something which I'm looking forward to. It would be a very interesting shift in digital product design.
How far do you think we are from that point?
I think it could be very. It could be a reality in the next year or so,
Not very far.
or at least like people would be experimenting with it, because you see. No matter what the claims of the AI industry are, there are technologies which tend to stay, and then people make their own usage out of it. So um, that seems to be a big shift.
Got it.
But then again, I'm not so much into trends and forecasting as an expert. I go by what I get to hear from my colleagues and industry experts. So yeah.
Yes. We have one more question from Swasti Parikh. How do we design services where AI and humans work together without losing trust?
I mean, that's a very interesting question, but at the same time, it's a compound question, at least in my understanding. Uh, is it that the AI in this case is the deliverer of a service or the provider of a service, versus is it partaking the service itself with you? For example, uh, imagine when you ask your chat gpt to search from a number of internet resources to find out, let's say, a piece of information, or book a ticket for you, right? Or make online purchases for you.
Hmm.
So in this case, you and your AI are basically interacting with another AI or another platform, and it's on the receiving side, right? While it is still providing a service to you by coagulating this data, right? So again, how much of it is supposed to be you being a co-thinker, right? And then trusting it as a counterpart, versus you using it as a provider and then trusting it as somebody who can solve your query or solve your problem. It has two very different dimensions,
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
uh, it's just like when you experience the same service with another human, on the receiving end you are able to empathize with each other, while if the same human is on the other side of the counter, you may not be able to empathize with them,
Right.
and you might feel entitled to receive a certain output based on the cost that you've
Yeah.
put in, or
Yeah.
the efforts you've put in. So again, it's like the dynamics of uh, living with AI have changed so much, and it's something that we will have to build our own mental models around.
Right. So in these
Uh,
a few different aspects that you
so
mentioned
probably that.
about, sorry, please complete, Siddharth. All
No, no,
right.
I'm done.
All right. I was asking in these different aspects that you mentioned about how we work with AI, where AI is while we are working with them, like what role does it have? What role would you assign if AI was a team member under you or with you in your team?
Well, I would rather use AI as something that helps me think with them. So it's like you talking to your colleague,
Mhm.
or discussing with your colleague, uh, and kind of sharing what all do you know versus what all do they know,
Yes.
while also keeping in mind that what all they know is also limited
Right.
and comes from a certain place of thinking, which is essentially their training data, right?
Yes. Yes.
Rather than seeing it as the universal answerer, which we have used, for example, search engines as. So,
Right.
yeah, I think that would be a very relevant use of it, at least the current models with the current capability.
Right. We have one more question from Shagun Parab, and post this is the last question, Siddharth, for lack of time again. Working alongside AI is what we are advised to do, but sometimes it is difficult to not get carried away and overly depend on it. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, it's. I mean, that's very true. We have all faced that, Shakun. What you're saying. The it's all about how we perceive information, right? It's the same problem when you let's say read a research paper, uh, and you feel that what the author is saying is, let's say, an empirical truth. But when you read the next research paper, and let's say you come up with, like, the next author is coming up with findings which are different from the first one, then you begin to understand that there is more to this reality, right, that you're researching on. Or is the same with reading multiple articles or books, right? Every author has their own thinking, which comes from their life experience, right? When you read through many of those, then you netify these outputs and see, what your perception should be to something. It's probably the same working with AI, at least in my experience, because uh, whenever you give a problem area, or you start inputting certain types of data and it starts telling you something, you have to understand that this could be one of the ways to think of it and not the way to think of it, right? And then, of course, you can make the context richer, provide it with more data, and see how the answer changes. And then, of course, use your own capabilities of trying to judge which one would fit in the worldly context that you know, because ultimately it comes down to your accountability as a designer, right? You can't hold a machine accountable. It's you as the practitioner who has to account for it. So that's something that
Right.
is my learning, at least from.
Yeah, I think we almost all of us, not just designers, but almost all of us who are working with AI have at some point of time. In fact, even I wouldn't deny for me today has feel overwhelmed with AI. That is very true for all of us. This brings us to the rapid fire, which is the last part of this show. So, Siddharth, I'll be asking you three questions, and you can only answer them in one word or maybe one sentence if needed. All right.
Sure,
So
I'll try
first
my
question
best.
is, yes. First question is, what might designers be currently overestimating and underestimating about AI?
I think its ability to give the right answers, because there are no such right answers. There are contextually right and wrong answers.
True.
So I think, yeah, that's
Okay.
something that
Okay. One discipline outside design you think service designers should be studying right now?
I think revenue generation and understanding business from the perspective of sales. That's the
Why
biggest
would
thing.
you? Why are you stressing on that point?
Because that's when you understand that how user spending behavior gets affected.
Got it. Got
it's
it.
it's very little to do with personal liking, as what we try to study, or the trends that people follow, and it's more about what is the economic context in which they are operating.
Makes sense.
And I think that's a very valuable piece of information, even to be able to make our work useful for the larger business, because business is always done in terms of um, input and output costs. And
Yes.
if we don't connect that, if we don't connect to that logic, we'll only be seen on the sidelines.
That is true. Yeah, yeah. All right, the last question. One thing researchers should stop doing and one thing that they should start doing.
I think one thing they should stop doing is relying too much on AI based analysis. And what they should start doing definitely is actually talking to humans and producing uh, high quality, contextually rich data.
Got it. Yes. I think that is also something special that we designers are very well equipped to do.
Yes, always.
Yes.
That's our primary suit, that's our primary capability,
Yeah.
which we should never let go of.
Yes. Yes. All right. So that this brings us to the end of today's show. Thank you so much for being here and sharing your insights.
Thank you for giving me this stage, and it was really a great conversation. And I think I got a lot of things to rethink about as well, even from the panel side. The questions,
Yes.
there were some very thought-provoking questions.
All
So I
right.
think,
Yes.
yeah,
Yes.
it's a good thing. Thanks so
Okay.
much.
Thank you, Siddharth. Bye bye.
Bye.
All right, this brings us to the end. A few announcements from my end. We have exclusive student discounts for SDGC. If you have not gotten yet, you can scan the QR code and get it for yourself. We have special discount for public sector. And if you are a student, you can submit your project for student awards. You can scan the QR code, fill in the form, and you'll be able to submit your project for the awards. All right. Thank you. See you until the next session.